Welcome, everyone. So glad to have you joining together with us today in this celebration of H.P. Blavatsky, which, as most of you probably know, occurs every year around this time on the Sunday prior to May 8th, her death anniversary, and it's referred to as White Lotus Day. And it's given this name for several reasons. The lotus, or Padma, is a very ancient simile for both the cosmos and for humanity, therefore uniting macrocosm and microcosm into a single symbol. The flower opening to the sun above the waters is emblematic, as we know, of radiant spiritual awakening, white being indicative of purity and the logoic synthesis of all colors. Many regard H.P. Blavatsky as not simply the mother of the New Age, as she is often called, but one in a long line of messengers of that celestial bodhisattva of boundless compassion known as Padmapani, whose symbol is the lotus, and who both watches over and blesses all life and aids all evolution through sacrificial service and enlightened wisdom in action. What becomes clear when we study her life and the quest that she embodied, which I think, as you'll agree, once we go through this short biography, that she did exemplify Buddha Yoga, not just Buddha Yoga, but Guru Yoga. And that we find that we cannot separate HPB from any part of the teaching that she left, from the masters who she served, nor from the entire Guru Parampara chain, long line of such sages, reformers, and spiritual teachers, reaching back to the primeval races and ages. Nor can we separate her from the most neglected and downtrodden, the most lost, reviled, and forgotten members of the human family. In fact, if we take her teaching to heart, we cannot separate her from any being whatsoever, any life atom or kingdom of nature, visible or invisible, which she sought to awaken our love for and our sense of unity with through a unique and Buddhic articulation of the timeless perennial philosophy. So today we're drawing from many resources, including the two best biographies that we know of, W. Kingland's The Real H.P. Blavatsky, which was published in 1928, and Sylvia Cranston's The Extraordinary Life and Influence of Helena Blavatsky, which was published in 1993. Based on their narration, we can divide HPB's mysterious 60-year incarnation into 5 main periods. The first, from birth in 1831 to 17 years of age, at which point she renounced the comforts of conventional home and family life in favor of an irrepressible spiritual quest to fulfill her life's dharma as a servant and messenger of her guru and master. The second, from age 17 to age 41, a 25-year period about which the least is known, where she tirelessly crisscrossed the globe several times, fearlessly educating, maturing, and training herself in the most remote and hidden centers of occult practice, of mystic and esoteric study worldwide. The third period is marked by her third arrival on American soil in 1873, where she settled for 6 years, eventually becoming an American citizen, and where she began her more public literary, organizational, and teaching efforts. And this, of course, included the formal inauguration of the Theosophical Society in New York City on November 17th, 1875. Then, after writing and securing the publication of Isis Unveiled, she left the US for India in 1879, marking the beginning of the fourth stage. And during this 6-year period in India, under her magnetic tutelage and masterful instruction, dozens of branch societies were established, including the TS headquarters in Adyar, Madras. Then in 1885, in a coma and pronounced on the verge of death by her doctors, she was dramatically revived through the intervention of her master in order to complete the final 6 years of culminating effort. Returning to Europe that year, she immediately began the writing of The Secret Doctrine, her magnum opus, published only 3 years later in 1888. And this was quickly followed 1 year later by the publication of The Voice of the Silence and The Key to Theosophy in 1889. It was in the final phase in London that she also met Mohandas Gandhi, who subsequently became an associate of the TS there. In addition, just 2 years before passing, she established an esoteric section of the Blavatsky Lodge, modeled on the trans-Himalayan tradition, designed to support and nourish the public work and prepare students for the rigorous discipline, trials, and demands of the practical embodiment of the Bodhisattva ideal in the service of humanity. At midnight on August 11th, 1831, Helena Petrovna Hahn was born in eastern Ukraine, a city now known as Dnipro, located on the banks of the Dnieper River. Descendant of a line of aristocrats of German and Russian nobility, her family name Hahn literally means rooster. In Baltic traditions, associated with a dragon-like deity of the sun and of fire. In Ukrainian folklore, Helena's birth date suggested she would have great and mysterious powers. And since the robes of the presiding priest caught fire at her christening, it was believed that her life would be difficult. Her mother was a direct descendant of the 9th century Grand Duke Rurik, the first Tsar to govern Russia. Only 17 years old at Helena's birth, her mother was a talented writer who later became a famous novelist. In large part, Helena, however, was cared for and classically educated by professional tutors and her maternal grandmother, Princess Helena Pavlovna Fadeev, who was a self-taught botanist and archaeologist, as well as superb artist and musician who studied classical Greek and spoke 5 languages fluently. And it was from her grandmother's library, which she had inherited from Prince Paul, that HPB consumed hundreds of books on alchemy, magic, and other occult sciences, all before the age of 15. HPB's father, Peter von Hahn, was an army colonel who, because of repeated transfers from urban centers to remote rural areas, meant that even HPB's childhood involved long journeys by horse and sometimes camel in covered wagons, and cross-cultural influences of the most varied sort. Sorry. By all accounts, even as a child, HPB was both telepathic and a gifted clairvoyant who could see into, converse, and interact with hidden beings and dimensions of nature. Her sister Vera wrote, "For Helena, all nature seemed animated with a mysterious life of its own. She heard the voice of every object and form, whether organic or inorganic, and claimed consciousness and being, not only for some mysterious powers, visible and audible to herself alone, in what to everyone else was empty space, but even for visible but inanimate things, such as pebbles, molds, and pieces of decaying phosphorescent timber. Like a trained psychrometer, she could or she would captivate the other children with long stories of events linked to the objects, artifacts, and animals around them, as though she had actually witnessed them herself. In addition, from the age of 4, she wrote in her adult life that she could make bells ring, move furniture, and other objects about, which were common occurrences in the Han household, through the use of her astral body, acting independently of the physical. Wise beings unknown to her family were also interested in her welfare. According to A.P. Sinnett, from her earliest recollections, HPB would see daily visions of a mature protector whose imposing appearance dominated her imagination. In later life, she met him as a living man and knew him as though she had been brought up in his presence. On several occasions during her childhood, Helena's life was saved in mysterious ways, apparently through her guru's timely intervention. As a child, HPB was irrepressible, mischievous, uncontrollable, and fiery of temperament. She was full of, quote, acute humor and brilliant wit, and loved to joke, tease, and create a commotion. Her laughter was said to have had a sparkling authenticity and vivacity like no other. Its contagious, childlike joy remained with her throughout her life. She also harbored genuine empathy for the neglected and downtrodden. Even in her childhood, Aunt Nadia told Sinnett, she displayed a pronounced indifference to the privileges of class and false nobility. Instead, quote, all her sympathies and attractions went out towards people of the lower class. She always preferred to play with her servants' children and had to be watched for fear she would escape from the house to make friends with ragged street boys. She was so kind and so daring that she was ready to give everything away to the needy, to do everything for a remembered friend, and to decide upon any action in defense of the injured. While, quote, she never remembered evil or injury done to herself. At the same time, quote, no old scholar could be more assiduous in his study, and she could not be prevailed upon to give up her books, which she would devour night and day as long as the impulse lasted, unquote. She was also, apparently, perfectly at ease, telling people to their faces exactly what she thought of them, much to the embarrassment of her elders. And this was also a trait that she carried with her into adulthood, unwilling to coddle the polite pretensions and hypocrisies of the false ego in any that she encountered. Further defying all conventional expectations and what would have been a cultured life of luxury and comfort, at age 17, H.P. Blavatsky fled family, husband, and home life in search of what she called in one of her letters, the philosopher's stone, and those who could show her the path or secret to the union of soul and spirit. We know she traveled first across Europe, Greece, and the Middle East. In Cairo, HPB met Dr. Albert Rawson, author of many books on religion, philology, and archaeology. She revealed to him that she was, quote, engaged in a work that would someday free mankind from mental bondage. This work is not mine, she said, but his that sent me. Though only 19 years old, in the Middle East, she later wrote, quote, I lived with the whirling dervishes, with the Druzes of Mount Lebanon, with the Bedouin Arabs and marabouts of Damascus. I found it, meaning the Philosopher's Stone, nowhere. The turning point came in 1851, the year of the Great Exhibition in Hyde Park, London, and its famous Crystal Palace, housing the latest technologies and wares of all nations. Vowed to secrecy regarding the event. It was not until 2 years later, after HPB died, that this extraordinary meeting became publicly known. Amidst an Indian delegation that was present there in London for the exhibition was a tall Indian gentleman who she immediately recognized as her guru, protector, and blessed master. Quote, he spoke of a work he was about to undertake, unquote, which required her cooperation and for which she would be attacked and vilified in the court of public opinion. Quote, to prepare for it, she would need to spend 3 years in Tibet, unquote. From that day forward, she later narrated, everything was done in strict obedience to her teacher. From that moment, her extraordinary energies and indomitable will were focused upon one aim, to serve the masters without fail. That same year, she traveled to Canada and America, from which she passed on from Texas into Mexico to Central and South America, probably in the vicinity of a true mystery school located nearby. In Honduras, she met up with a Hindu-born chela, with whom she traveled via steamship around the southern tip of Africa to Ceylon and Bombay. She traveled in India dressed as a man, she said, for to travel alone as a woman was unacceptable. She attempted to enter Tibet at this time via Nepal, but was thwarted, as later verified by the British Major General who prevented her. In 1854, age 23, HPB returned to England, where, according to Vera, she was detained there for some time under contract. Quote, having distinguished herself by her musical talents, she became a member of the Philharmonic Society. While in London, she again unexpectedly met her teacher on 2 brief occasions. And again, the same year, she crossed the Atlantic to New York and then to Chicago, where she proceeded to make the dangerous crossing of the Great Plains, Rocky Mountains, and the Sierra Nevada with immigrants' caravans, such as we're seeing here. There were only 33 states in the Union at that time, and the Transcontinental Railroad had not yet been built. From San Francisco, she embarked by steamship again to the Orient, arriving in India for the second time, age 25, in 1856. Not only did she meet and travel with the Mahatmas, their chelas and disciples on this occasion, but was also able to enter Tibet via Kashmir. In a letter to Sinet, Master K.H. mentions that HPB's ecstatic rapture was so overwhelming when meeting her teachers in India that she had to be temporarily plunged into a profound sleep, or, quote, she would have burst some blood vessel, including kidneys, liver, and her interiors, unquote. Some of the remarkable, magical, and hair-raising events occurring on both of these trips through India were described by her in a series of articles under the pen name Radhabai, which appeared in popular Moscow periodicals years afterward. Translated into English, portions were compiled into book form and titled The Caves and Jungles of Hindustan, published in 1892. And by the way, we ran across this note that in 2012, this Russian author, historian, and Indologist, Alexander Senkevich, wrote that these essays, at the time they appeared in Russia, were a stunning success. He called them a work of enviable erudition, a country-specific encyclopedia, which to this day, he says, has not lost its scientific value as an objective assessment and condemnation of English colonial rule, and a psychological document reflecting many facets of the Indian spiritual world. Apparently, her mission was requiring her to learn firsthand, both empirically and metaphysically, the complexities and possibilities of human nature, both for good and for evil, the nature of both white magic and black magic. Having returned to Russia and traveling in the Caucasus at 32 years of age, she is said to have emerged from a prolonged death struggle with a greater mastery of her faculties and their control over lesser forces. And this was recognized by all those who knew her both before and after. Undaunted in any danger, in 1867, she was in Mentana, Italy, where she aided Garibaldi's revolutionary troops attempting to release Rome from the grips of the Catholic papacy. She later showed Alcott where, in battle, her arm was broken in 2 places by a saber, and where musket bullets were still embedded, one in her shoulder and one in her leg. By stark contrast, only 1 year later, she accompanied her master in yet another trip to India for her first extended stay in Tibet, starting in 1868. HPB indicated that Tibet is only one of several esoteric schools, quote, the seat of which is beyond the Himalayas and whose ramifications may be found in China, Japan, India, Tibet, and even Syria, besides South America. That's a quote from the SD Volume 1. In her letters, she stated, quote, there is beyond the Himalayas a nucleus of adepts of various nationalities, and the Teshu, that is the Panchen Lama, knows them, and they act together. And some of them are with him and yet remain unknown in their true character, even to the average lamas, unquote. All such adepts, she said on another occasion, having the capacity to veil or unveil themselves as needed. Quote, my master and KH and several others I know personally are there, coming and going, and they are all in communication with adepts in Egypt and Syria and even Europe. In the SD, H.P. Blavatsky explains that in 1357, a ray of Amitabha, the Dhyani of boundless time and infinite light, the same logoic being who manifested through Gautama Buddha, appeared in Tibet as the adept teacher Tsongkhapa. To preserve and promulgate the wisdom religion, he founded the Gelugpa order and initiated the tradition of Dalai and Panchen Lamas. This was one aspect of an unfolding series of 7 impulsions to occur in the last 25 years of each century, in which efforts by the masters would prepare humanity through mental and spiritual revitalization for the 6th the distant sixth subrace. Tsongkhapa's direct disciple, Gedun Drup, was the first Dalai Lama, who founded Tashi Lumpo in 1477. Which became the largest, most vibrant monastery in all of Tibet. And it was apparently in the hidden libraries and retreat of the Panchen Lama in the vicinity of Tashi Lumpo, where HPB studied the esoteric books central to the composition of the secret doctrine and the voice of the silence. Shortly after returning to Europe, HPB received orders to go again to New York. She left the following day, but gave up her first-class ticket to purchase 4 steerage tickets for herself, a destitute woman, and her 2 children, in what must have been a nightmarish 2-week excursion below deck on rough seas. Arriving in New York on July 7th, 1873, she established herself, earned a simple living, and began to meet the people most deeply involved in the examination of spiritualistic phenomena. And this marked the beginning of a 6-year stay in America that led to her meeting H.S. Olcott and W.Q. Judge in 1874. The first meeting between Judge and HPB is famous, for it altered Judge for life and profoundly affected the Theosophical movement. Having seen, quote, the lion's glance, the diamond heart of HPB, Judge spent many evenings learning from her. From midnight to 4 a.m., he wrote, were, quote, glorious hours spent in listening to the words of those illuminated ones who came when all was still and talked by the hour, watching or instructing us. HPB's involvement with spiritualistic groups in her early days in America is often misrepresented. Spiritualism was the rage in both Europe and America. Seances were held even in the Lincoln White House. On the one hand, HPB knew that psychic phenomena could help to awaken both modern science and dogmatic religion to the reality of hidden planes and latent capacities in human nature. On the other hand, she and Judge repeatedly point out in their writings how spiritualistic phenomena are misunderstood by the spiritualists themselves, that mediumistic practices have long been known in the East as necromancy, a form of black magic, gravely dangerous and positively ruinous to moral and spiritual development. In July of 1875, HPB's scrapbook indicates that, quote, orders received from India direct to establish a philosophy religious society and choose a name for it, also to choose Olcott, unquote. Others have tried to take credit for the name, but 7 months prior to this, she had first used the term theosophy in a letter to Professor Corson of Cornell University, calling it a system which would disclose to humanity the deepest depths of divine nature and show them the real tie which binds all things together. In the first 2 years, the Theosophical Society attracted little public attention, though HPB received a continuous flow of visitors, it is said, from around the world at her home, nicknamed the Lamasery. Olcott wrote, quote, the social distinctions of our visitors were left outside our threshold, and the rich or poor, Christian, Jew, or infidel, learned or unlearned, our visitors received the same hearty welcome and patient attention. HPB was so great an aristocrat as to be at ease in the highest society, and so thorough a democratic altruist as to give cordial hospitality to the humblest caller, unquote. She also began an extraordinary output of writing, publishing articles released to the local press, while also working intently upon her first book. Having learned to read and write English under her guru in Tibet, in 3 years, she wrote and published a 1,200-page two-part volume, Isis Unveiled, a master key to the mysteries of ancient and modern science and theology. Though she was restricted from giving out many theosophical doctrines contained in later work, and though she readily admits later how jumbled and imperfect the work was, it still ignited or is said to have ignited an intellectual fervor and had a profound impact in America and England. The first edition of 1,000 copies, for example, sold in 10 days, and dozens of editions have been printed since. W.Q. Judge accompanied her when she signed the contract for its publication. Quote, "When that document was signed," he later wrote, "she said to me in the street, 'Now I must go to India.'" As another side note, according to Dr. Edward Kahns, who I believe passed away in the 90s, was a very well-known Buddhist scholar and translator of Prajnaparamita literature, said that the year 1875 marked an event of great importance in his eyes because he traveled in the Orient a great deal, knew many Buddhists and Hindus in the East. He says that prior to European civilization, prior to this period, European civilization seemed immensely strong, and even the educated in India, Ceylon, and Japan felt they had no option but to adopt the Western system. Christian missionaries looked forward to speedy mass conversions. However, he says, the founding of the Theosophical Society and its activities, quote, accelerated the influx of knowledge about Asiatic religions to the West and restored self-confidence in the wavering minds of the Asiatics themselves. Theosophists from Asia, or from Russia, rather, America, and England, he said, quote, appeared among the Hindus and Ceylonese to proclaim their admiration for the ancient wisdom of the East. And this goes along very much with what HPB wrote 10 years later in 1889. She said, when we arrived in India in February 1879, there was no unity among the races and sects of the peninsula, no sense of a common public interest, no disposition to find the mutual relation between the several sects of ancient Hinduism, or that between them and the creeds of Islam, Jainism, Buddhism, and Zoroastrianism. Social and religious, as well as material and physical differences, were breeding race hatreds, she said, sectarian and social antipathies that seemed insurmountable. Quote, 10 years have passed, and what do we see? Throughout India, unity and brotherhood have replaced the old disunity. 125 branches of our society have sprung up in India alone, each a nucleus of our idea of fraternity, a center of religious and social unity. She goes on to list the many specific influences the society and its members have had on Indian culture: the formation of the Indian National Congress, the revival of the non-sectarian strains of Hinduism and Buddhism, advances in educational practices where students are made more aware of their ancient ancestral teachings and their scientific basis, and a general revival of interest in Sanskrit language and scholarship. But then she adds that the key to all our successes is what she called occultism, our recognition of the fact of the higher self, colorless, cosmopolitan, unsectarian, sexless, unworldly, altruistic, and the doing of our work on that basis, unquote. It was only that sacred affirmation, she said, an appeal to the intuition that could touch the heart, she wrote, quote, and sweep away the old barriers and turn the rulers of nations away from selfish war and schemes of conquest. In 1883 alone, in writing articles for the Theosophist, HPB added over 700 pages to her eventual 14 volumes of collected writings. The society by now had a broad international impact, and its success was marked by the appearance of real chelas like Damodar Mavalankar and Bhavani Shankar, as well as a host of jealous and small-minded self-seekers, all great spiritual teachers or moral reformers, as we know, challenge the narrow judgments and prejudices that lie deep within the human psyche. The esoteric wisdom which H.P. Blavatsky was commissioned to bring into the world was at the same time a severe blow to any thought form which was stagnating, claustrophobic, or in any way detrimental to the tidal wave of philosophical mysticism and altruism arising within humanity. Opposing forces were many, from Orientalists and less perceptive scholars, from proponents of exoteric religion or sectarian dogmatism, from spiritualism and materialistic science, but also from those whom she personally aided and helped the most. Attacks also came from students within the movement. On invisible planes, no doubt, the battle was most severe. It was not the Indian climate, explained her master later, that adversely affected her health, but the forces which opposed the proper fruition and of her incarnation and of the movement. Around New Year's Eve, 1882, a stranger visited HPB at the India headquarters at Adyar. From the man's background, one would think him unlikely to pursue an audience with her. His name was R. Jagannathia, and he was an educated native, an author, and contributor to a journal called the Philosophical Inquirer, but it was a secular journal. And he was both a confirmed atheist and member of the National Secular Society in England, and had carefully prepared himself for this meeting with HPB by formulating the most difficult and insoluble questions that he could muster. And he was first introduced to HPB by Damodar Mavalankar in the meeting hall of the main building at Adyar. And she was apparently seated in a chair and surrounded by a small group of students when he was introduced. And he wrote about this event later. Quote, the first impression she made on me was that she was not of this earth, as she had a pair of glowing but terrible eyes under the arch of strongly marked eyebrows. She was a woman in body, a man in speech, earthly in appearance, celestial in reality. Ah, exclaimed she, I expected that you would come to me someday. I asked her how she could expect me, since she was a theosophist and I am an atheist. She asked Mr. Damodar to fetch her scrapbook and showed me some cuttings from my lectures on Kapila, Buddha, and Shankara, and said that she was had been carefully reading my contributions to the Philosophic Inquirer, which she appreciated, as they breathed a spirit of inquiry after truth. As secularism was insufficient to satisfy my higher aspirations, She reasonably concluded that I would go to her for further light on the problem of problems, the mystery of life and death. So as you know, I'm quoting directly now from his writing. But he speaks about, and you can imagine how stunned he is in the way that she's greeted him in this way. To my great astonishment, she took up question after question and answered each most elaborately and satisfactorily. She occupied nearly 3 hours that day in solving my questions. The array of facts she cited in support of her forcible and incontrovertible arguments, historical, philosophical, and scientific, confused my poor intellect. The whole audience was spellbound, and one peculiar point in her answering I cannot afford to omit. Her mastery of the various subjects was such that in her answer, all the side questions were anticipated and disposed of once for all. On the second and third day, we were thus occupied for hours in the presence of the same audience, as the interest daily increased in proportion to my more and more difficult questions and her most able and satisfactory answers. On the third day, after answering the questions, on which I spent much thought and care, mustering all the force of my atheistic knowledge and learning, she cheerfully asked me if I had anything more to say. Readily and unreservedly, I answered that my stock was exhausted, and this afforded food for laughter for a few minutes to the whole company. My idea was that theosophy was something like the many religions of the world, and that HPB's knowledge and ingenuity might be a little more than those of the ordinary student. Emboldened by this hasty idea, I went to shear, but returned shorn. Glad was I to be defeated by her, for my defeat was an immense gain for me, as she opened my eyes to the slippery ground on which I then stood. In 3 days, she shattered my 7 years' knowledge of atheistic theories. This giant of intellect, wisdom, and might asked me what I thought of theosophy, and if I would join the Theosophical Society and help the movement if I were convinced of the truth of theosophy. She founded the Theosophical Society, she said, under the orders of her guru, an Indian Mahatma, a rishi, and came to disseminate a knowledge of Brahma Vidya, the wisdom religion. But to her regret, many an intelligent and learned Hindu kept aloof from the movement and looked with some suspicion on her for her Western origin and alien race. I readily responded that I would join and work and die for the sacred cause, so long as a spark of life existed in this body. I have been so working ever since, always alive to the sacredness of my promise to HPB, who opened my eyes and enlightened my ignorance. She turned my attention to the precious and lustrous gems of knowledge lying deep in the Oriental mines of wisdom. Very kindly and motherly advice she gave me in bidding me read the Upanishads, which were Schopenhauer's solace in life and solace in death. Very touching story. So we're going to end this portion with a quote from W.Q. Judge, her most faithful and truest friend, and who wrote the following after her passing. Her aim was to elevate the race. Her method was to deal with the mind of the century as she found it, by trying to lead it on, step by step, to seek out and educate a few who, appreciating the majesty of the secret science, and devoted to the great orphan humanity, could carry on her work with zeal and wisdom. To found a society whose efforts, however small it might be, would inject into the thought of the day the ideas, the doctrines, the nomenclature of the wisdom religion, so that when the next century shall have seen its 75th year, the new messenger coming again into the world would find the society still at work, the ideas sown broadcast, the nomenclature ready to give expression and body to the immutable truth, and thus to make easy the task, which for her since 1875 was so difficult and so encompassed with obstacles in the very paucity of the language, obstacles harder than all else to work against.
Porque na vida a gente quer se conhecer, pra